Thomas Sterling saved her life without recognizing luxury. Catherine froze as their eyes met on that dark street. The homeless man who just fought off her attacker was the husband she divorced for losing his billions, the man she called too poor to love. He stood in rags, breath clouding the cold air, blood on his knuckles from defending the woman who abandoned him. She wore diamonds he would never touch again. He simply said, "Stay safe," and walked back into the shadows, carrying more dignity in his poverty than she had accumulated in all her remarried wealth. In that moment, Catherine understood she had divorced the wrong thing. Not a poor man, but the only man who ever valued her beyond her reflection in his fortune. Subscribe to witness the full story of the homeless ex-billionaire and the ex-wife who finally learned what wealth truly means. The November wind cut through the Manhattan streets like a blade made of memory and cold, carrying with it the scent of distant rain and the peculiar emptiness that settles over the city when wealth sleeps behind locked doors and the forgotten walk the same pavements where they once commanded entire empires. Thomas Sterling moved through these streets with the particular grace of someone who had learned to become invisible. His body thin beneath layers of donated clothing that hung loose on a frame that once filled custom Italian suits, his face weathered by 2 years of exposure to elements that had previously existed only as abstractions viewed through penthouse windows. He walked without destination because destinations implied futures, and futures required the kind of hope that poverty systematically extracts from the human heart, leaving only the immediate present, only the next meal, only the question of where warmth might be found when darkness deepened and temperatures dropped below the threshold of survival. His shoes, split along the soles and held together with wire and determination, made soft, shuffling sounds against concrete that had once trembled beneath his confident stride, back when he moved through this same city as its master, rather than its ghost. The streets held no contempt for his fall, because streets remember everything and judge nothing, having witnessed countless transformations from power to powerlessness, from relevance to erasure, from the man who commanded boardrooms to the shadow who sleeps in doorways, hoping tomorrow's soup kitchen opens early. Thomas had learned their language during his descent, the way the wealthy never do, had discovered that New York speaks differently to those without shelter, reveals corridors and corners and possibilities invisible to eyes that have never needed to calculate the distance between danger and safety, between exposure and protection, between tonight and tomorrow morning. He knew which alleys remained warm from subway vents, which building superintendents turned blind eyes to overnight guests in basement stairwells, which 24-hour diners would allow a man to nurse a single cup of coffee through the darkest hours if he kept quiet and didn't disturb the paying customers. This knowledge represented his only remaining wealth, earned through brutal education in a curriculum designed to break spirits and test exactly how much loss a human being can sustain before the essential self dissolves entirely into the machinery of survival. Catherine's world existed in a different dimension entirely, one constructed from the same materials, steel, glass, concrete, money, but arranged according to principles that might as well have been sorcery for all the connection they bore to Thomas's current reality. She moved through Manhattan in climate-controlled vehicles that transported her from secured residences to exclusive destinations without her feet ever touching public pavement. Her days structured around lunches that cost more than some families spent on groceries in a month. Her evenings devoted to charity galas, where the wealthy congratulated themselves for caring while ensuring the distance between themselves and actual suffering remained comfortably unbridgeable. She had rebuilt her fortune, or rather, she had married into one, had found another billionaire willing to provide the lifestyle she considered her natural birthright, and if sometimes in the hollow hours between midnight and dawn she thought about Thomas, about what they had been before the collapse of his financial empire. She dismissed these thoughts as nostalgia for a version of him that no longer existed, that perhaps had never existed outside her own projection of what wealth could purchase, including loyalty, including love. Tonight, she walked alone through a neighborhood that existed on the border between her world and Thomas's, one of those transitional zones where expensive restaurants shared sidewalks with check-cashing stores, where luxury condominiums rose above street-level businesses that catered to survival rather than leisure. She had dismissed her driver for the evening, wanting privacy for a meeting she preferred to keep away from her current husband's attention. And now she regretted the decision as she noticed how darkness gathered in doorways and how few other pedestrians shared the sidewalk at this hour. Her heels clicked against concrete with sounds that seemed to announce vulnerability and wealth simultaneously, and she clutched her designer handbag closer, feeling the weight of her phone inside, knowing that safety was just a call away, that her entire life was structured around the principle that money could purchase distance from discomfort, from danger, from any consequence that couldn't be delegated to someone paid to absorb it on her behalf. The irony didn't occur to her that she was thinking about Thomas at the exact moment she heard footsteps accelerating behind her. Didn't register until much later that her last thought before the attack was about the man she had divorced for being too poor to deserve her. The mugger moved with the efficiency of someone who had performed this dance many times before, grabbing her arm and spinning her against the brick wall of a closed storefront with enough force to knock the breath from her lungs and send her handbag tumbling to the pavement. She tried to scream, but fear had closed her throat, had reduced her voice to a whisper of sound that wouldn't carry beyond the immediate space, where she suddenly understood that all her wealth meant exactly nothing, that money couldn't protect her in this moment, that she was just flesh and bone facing another human being who had decided she possessed something he wanted, and that violence represented the most efficient method of transfer. The mugger's face remained shadowed beneath a hood, but she could see his eyes, could see the calculation happening there, the assessment of how much resistance she might offer, how much noise she might make, how quickly this transaction could be completed before anyone intervened. Time seemed to stretch and compress simultaneously, seconds becoming hours, becoming eternities. And she thought about her current husband sleeping in their penthouse, about all the security she took for granted, about how strange it was that death or injury might arrive like this. Randomly, on a street corner, she happened to walk down at exactly the wrong moment. Then Thomas appeared like memory made solid, like ghost made flesh, moving from shadows with a speed that his ragged appearance had concealed, his body still remembering movements learned in a gym back when physical fitness was hobby rather than survival requirement, his hands gripping the mugger's shoulders and pulling him away from Catherine with force that surprised them both. The mugger stumbled, recovered, raised his fist, but Thomas stood his ground with the particular fearlessness of someone who had already lost everything that could be taken from him, had discovered that poverty strips away not just comfort but also the fear of further loss, leaving only the immediate moral imperative of right action in the present moment. They faced each other for 3 heartbeats while Catherine pressed herself against the brick wall, her mind still processing the impossibility of rescue, still trying to understand why this homeless man would risk injury for a stranger, still several seconds away from the recognition that would transform this moment from miracle into nightmare made of regret and shame compounded. The fight lasted no more than 30 seconds, but contained within that half-minute all the compressed violence of their separate journeys, all the distance between what they had been and what they had become, colliding in the physical space between defense and attack. The mugger swung wild, catching Thomas across the jaw with enough force to snap his head sideways and draw blood from his lip. But Thomas didn't fall, didn't retreat, simply absorbed the blow and moved forward, using his body as shield between threat and the woman behind him, his arms raised in protection rather than aggression, his stance communicating that he would accept injury before allowing harm to pass through him. The mugger assessed the situation with the cold mathematics of predators everywhere, calculating that this resistance represented more trouble than the potential reward justified, that easier targets waited just blocks away, that prolonging this encounter increased his risk without proportional benefit. He backed away slowly, eyes locked on Thomas, then turned and ran, his footsteps fading into the acoustic maze of the city night, leaving only silence and heavy breathing, and the question of what happens when the rescued looks up and sees the rescuer's face. Catherine remained against the wall for a long moment, her nervous system still processing threat, still flooding her body with chemicals designed for survival, her heart hammering against ribs that suddenly felt fragile as bird bones, her hands shaking with adrenaline and shock and the peculiar vulnerability that arrives when we realize how quickly everything can be taken from us, how thin the membrane between safety and catastrophe actually is. She looked up at her rescuer, preparing words of gratitude, preparing to ask his name so she could reward him appropriately, already calculating how money could transform this encounter into something manageable, something that fit within her understanding of how the world worked, where service received required payment rendered. But the words died unspoken when their eyes met, because recognition hit her like physical force, like a second attack more devastating than the first, like the universe folding back on itself to reveal the cruel joke it had been constructing for 2 years, while she rebuilt her life on the ruins of their marriage. Thomas saw the recognition arrive in her face, like dawn breaking over a landscape of devastation, saw her eyes widen and her mouth open slightly in shock, saw the precise moment when gratitude transformed into something far more complex and painful, something that included surprise and confusion, and the beginning of that terrible understanding that would pursue her through all her remaining days. He said nothing, because there was nothing to say, because words couldn't bridge the distance between the man in rags and the woman in diamonds, because she had already rendered her judgment on his worth when she signed the divorce papers and told him that poverty made him unworthy of her continued presence, that she hadn't married a failure, that she deserved someone who could maintain the lifestyle she had grown accustomed to rather than drag her down into his economic collapse. He remembered those words exactly, remembered the way she had said them, with the clinical precision of someone explaining a business decision, rather than the ending of 2 decades of shared life. Remembered how her voice had contained not anger, but disappointment, as though his bankruptcy represented a personal betrayal rather than a confluence of circumstances beyond any individual's control. She whispered his name, Thomas, and the word emerged broken, fragmented by disbelief and something else, something that might have been shame, if shame could arrive this quickly, this completely, without the careful construction of justification that usually precedes moral reckoning. He stood before her in clothing that smelled of streets and shelters, his face bearing the marks of exposure and poor nutrition and the particular aging that accompanies outdoor survival. His body thinner than she remembered, but somehow more present, more real than the man who had moved through their marriage, wearing wealth like armor against the world's sharp edges. Blood ran from the corner of his mouth where the mugger's fist had connected, and she found herself staring at that blood, at the evidence that he had accepted injury on her behalf, had placed his body between her and harm without knowing who she was, or perhaps knowing exactly who she was and doing it anyway, which seemed impossible given what she had done to him, given how completely she had severed every connection when his fortune evaporated. Catherine, he acknowledged, his voice rough from disuse, from too many nights sleeping in cold air, from speaking only when necessary, because conversation requires energy, and energy requires calories, and calories represent currency he no longer possessed in abundance. He said her name without inflection, without judgment, without any of the accusations she suddenly realized she deserved. And somehow that made everything worse, made her want to explain or defend or justify the choices she had made when his empire collapsed, and she decided that love without luxury represented an unacceptable downgrade. But the words wouldn't come, because what explanation could possibly suffice? What justification could bridge the gap between the woman who divorced her husband for being too poor and the woman who had just been rescued by that same man, living in the poverty she had condemned him for, willing to risk injury or worse for someone who had already communicated through the most binding legal documents that his worth depended entirely on his net worth? The street around them continued its indifferent existence, cars passing with headlights, cutting temporary illumination through darkness, distant sirens wailing their eternal chorus of urban emergency, the city breathing through its million mouths and demanding nothing from this moment, offering no comfort, no resolution, no narrative structure that would transform their encounter into something manageable or meaningful, beyond its raw reality. Thomas picked up her handbag from where it had fallen, extended it toward her with the careful politeness of someone who understands that proximity to wealth requires particular protocols, that even in his diminished state, he could trigger alarm systems built into her nervous system, alarms that would teach her to fear poverty as much as she feared violence, alarms that would remind her that the homeless represent threat simply by existing in spaces where wealth expects clear passage. She took the bag without touching his hand, an unconscious gesture that nonetheless communicated everything about the distance between them, about how completely she had accepted the logic that divided humans into categories of worthy and unworthy based solely on their economic utility. Memory arrived uninvited as Catherine clutched her recovered handbag, fragments of their shared past surfacing with the vividness of wounds reopened before healing completed, and she found herself suddenly displaced in time to 20 years earlier, when Thomas had been Thomas Sterling, the entrepreneur, the innovator, the man whose name appeared in business publications and whose investments shaped markets, and whose confidence had seemed less like arrogance than like gravity, an essential force that ordered reality around his presence. She had met him at a gallery opening, both of them young enough to believe that success represented destiny rather than circumstance. Both ambitious in the way that New York teaches ambition, not as crude hunger, but as sophisticated understanding that life divides into winners and everyone else, and that choosing which category to inhabit represented the most important decision anyone could make. Their courtship had been conducted in restaurants where meals cost more than monthly rent. Their engagement announced in newspapers that tracked the movements of people whose wealth made them newsworthy. Their wedding photographed for magazines that sold aspirational fantasies to readers who would never attend such events, but who needed to believe such events existed as rewards for sufficient ambition properly applied. The marriage itself had been comfortable in the way that money makes comfort, providing not just material ease, but also the deeper comfort of certainty. The knowledge that tomorrow would arrive with all the resources necessary to maintain today's standard of living, that crises could be solved with sufficient application of capital, that discomfort represented choice rather than inevitability. They had lived in a penthouse that offered views suggesting dominion over the city below, had travelled to destinations where poverty was either invisible or decorative, had moved through social circles where everyone understood that wealth represented both achievement and inheritance, both reward for merit and simple luck of birth. But that distinguishing between these sources mattered far less than the fact of wealth itself. Catherine had never questioned whether she loved Thomas or loved what Thomas provided, had never needed to separate the man from the lifestyle, because the lifestyle seemed essential to who the man was, seemed to emanate from him like light from a source, impossible to divide into component parts without destroying the essential nature of the whole. Then came the collapse, arriving not as single catastrophic event, but as series of dominoes falling through quarters and fiscal years, investments souring and markets contracting and partnerships dissolving and regulatory changes, creating suddenly impossible conditions for business models built on assumptions that no longer held. Thomas had fought to save his empire with the same confidence that had built it, working 18-hour days and risking everything on increasingly desperate attempts to reverse trajectories that possessed their own momentum, their own inevitability, their own indifference to human effort or intention. Catherine had watched from their penthouse as the walls closed in, had attended fewer parties and noticed how invitations dried up as their social circle's collective calculation determined that their trajectory had shifted from ascending to descending. That association with failure might contaminate those still succeeding. That friendship built on mutual prosperity couldn't survive the removal of that foundational element. She had told herself she was being supportive, was standing by her husband through temporary difficulties. But somewhere deeper, she was already performing calculations of her own, already measuring whether love could survive the loss of luxury, whether commitment could outlast the disappearance of comfort. The bankruptcy, when it finally arrived after 2 years of fighting, came almost as relief, ending the uncertainty and replacing it with the brutal clarity of complete loss, every asset liquidated, every account emptied, every possession of value seized and sold to satisfy creditors who had once competed for the privilege of lending to Thomas Sterling. They had moved from the penthouse to a small apartment in a neighborhood Catherine had never visited when they had been wealthy, had traded restaurants for grocery stores and takeout, had discovered that poverty isn't just the absence of money, but the presence of entirely different operating system for daily life, different rhythms and concerns and calculations that the wealthy never need to perform. Thomas had tried to rebuild, had sought employment in his former industry only to discover that failure marks you in ways that can't be hidden, that the business world treats bankruptcy like contagion, that starting over requires resources beyond mere effort when your reputation has been redefined by collapse. Catherine had watched him try and fail and try again, had watched his confidence erode and his body change, and his eyes take on the particular emptiness that arrives when hope becomes too expensive to maintain. She had lasted 6 months in their diminished circumstances before deciding she couldn't continue, couldn't accept that this was now her life, couldn't reconcile the future she had imagined with the present she was experiencing, couldn't find the woman she believed herself to be inside this small apartment with its thin walls and its view of nothing but other buildings housing other people who had also failed to achieve or maintain the heights. The divorce conversation had been businesslike, both of them understanding that their marriage had been built on foundations that no longer existed, that removing wealth had revealed how little actual connection remained, how much of what they called love had actually been shared participation in lifestyle rather than genuine intimacy between independent persons. She had told him he was too poor now, that she deserved someone who could provide the life she had grown accustomed to, and though she had phrased it as kindness, setting them both free to find more appropriate partners, they had both understood that she was abandoning him in his lowest moment, that she was treating their marriage as investment that had failed to provide adequate returns, that she was demonstrating exactly how conditional her love had always been. Thomas had signed the papers without protest because he had already lost everything else, and one more loss seemed almost trivial by comparison, seemed almost merciful in its finality, removing the obligation to maintain pretense that either of them still believed in promises made when circumstances were entirely different. She had married another billionaire within a year, had returned to the world she had temporarily departed, had resumed the lifestyle she considered natural and appropriate to her sense of self. And if sometimes she thought about Thomas, she dismissed these thoughts as wasteful attention to irrelevant past, as nostalgia for something that had never been as good as memory suggested. She had told herself she had made the right choice, the necessary choice, the only choice consistent with her values and her vision of who she was and who she deserved to be. Standing now on this dark street, with Thomas's blood visible in the streetlight glow and his ragged clothing testifying to exactly how poor he had become, Catherine felt all those justifications dissolve like paper in rain, revealing the truth she had refused to acknowledge for 2 years, that she had abandoned the man when he needed her most, because she valued comfort more than commitment, valued lifestyle more than loyalty, valued wealth more than the actual human being she had promised to love in poverty or prosperity, in sickness or health, until death provided the only acceptable reason for separation. Thomas stood before her like living proof of every fear that haunted the wealthy in their private moments, every nightmare about the impermanence of fortune and the possibility that security represents illusion rather than achievement, that any of them could find themselves on the street wearing donated clothing and eating from soup kitchens if circumstances shifted in directions beyond their control. His presence challenged the fundamental narrative Catherine had constructed about their divorce. The story she told herself where leaving him represented reasonable response to his failure rather than moral abandonment, where her actions emerged from self-preservation rather than selfishness, where his poverty justified her departure rather than demanding her loyalty. She had built her subsequent life on the foundation of that narrative, had remarried believing she had upgraded from failed husband to successful one, had resumed her position in the social circles that equated wealth with worth and poverty with personal failure. And now Thomas stood before her, having just saved her life, having placed himself in danger for her sake, demonstrating that his value as human being bore no relationship whatsoever to his bank balance or his zip code or his net worth. "Stay safe, Catherine," he said finally, breaking the silence that had stretched between them while she processed recognition, and he waited for her to speak or move or do anything, besides stare at him with an expression mixing horror and disbelief, and something else he couldn't quite identify, something that looked almost like grief. His voice carried no anger, no accusation, no demand for acknowledgement or apology, just the simple wish that she remain unharmed, that she make it home safely to her current husband and her current life and her current certainties about how the world operates and who deserves what and why. He turned to leave, his body moving with the careful deliberation of someone who has learned to conserve energy, who understands that unnecessary movement represents waste, and waste represents risk when survival depends on precise calibration of resources against needs, when every calorie matters and every step must serve purpose beyond mere locomotion. Catherine's voice stopped him before he had taken 3 steps, emerging from her throat as broken sound that didn't resemble her usual controlled tone, didn't carry any of the confidence she had cultivated through decades of believing herself important and powerful and insulated from the consequences that plagued lesser humans. "Thomas, wait," she managed, and he paused but didn't turn around, his back to her, presenting less threat than his face, giving her space to speak without forcing eye contact, without demanding that she look at what she had done to him, what she had become in doing it. She tried to find words adequate to the moment, but language seemed suddenly insufficient, seemed designed for different purposes than apologizing for abandoning someone in their most desperate hour, than explaining why she had treated a human being as disposable when his utility to her vanished, than acknowledging that she had measured worth with entirely wrong instruments and destroyed something irreplaceable, because she hadn't understood its value until confronting it in its absence. "I didn't know," she began, then realized how absurd that sounded, how completely it missed the essential point, because of course she hadn't known he had become homeless, hadn't tracked his descent beyond the point where she stopped caring about his trajectory, hadn't considered that the man she divorced for being too poor might actually end up with no home at all, sleeping in shelters or doorways or wherever the homeless sleep, when shelters reach capacity and doorways belong to someone else. But not knowing seemed less like excuse than like indictment, less like justification than like additional evidence of her failure, because shouldn't she have known? Shouldn't she have checked? Shouldn't the woman who had shared 20 years of his life have maintained enough connection to understand that he had fallen far beyond uncomfortable into actual danger, into genuine suffering, into circumstances that could kill him through exposure or violence or the thousand other ways that poverty murders those caught in its machinery? Her lack of knowledge testified not to innocence, but to deliberate ignorance, to willful blindness, to choosing not to see because seeing would complicate the narrative she had constructed about their divorce being reasonable and justified and necessary. Thomas finally turned to face her, his expression carrying something like pity, and that was worse than anger would have been, worse than accusation, because pity meant he understood she was suffering in this moment, and that her suffering represented consequence of her own choices, her own values, her own demonstrated belief that human worth could be measured in dollars, and that people who lost money had lost the thing that made them valuable. "You didn't need to know," he said quietly, his words cutting through the cold air between them with precision that suggested he had thought about this moment, had imagined their reunion, had played through scenarios of what he might say if they ever stood face to face again, and what she might deserve to hear from him about what she had done and who she had revealed herself to be when circumstances tested the marriage vows she had spoken, but apparently never meant, not in the way those words were intended to mean. "You made your choice based on what you knew then, based on who I had become, based on what you valued most, and nothing that happened after changed those fundamental calculations." She wanted to protest that she would have acted differently if she had known, would have provided help or resources or something beyond complete abandonment, but even as the words formed in her mind, she recognized them as lies, as comfortable fictions she was constructing to protect herself from the truth that Thomas was speaking with brutal clarity, that she had valued his wealth more than his humanity, had loved his provision more than his person, had committed to the lifestyle he enabled rather than to the human being who enabled it. If she had known he was homeless, she might have felt guilt or pity, but she wouldn't have returned to him, wouldn't have resumed the marriage, wouldn't have chosen him over the new billionaire husband who could maintain her in the manner she had decided she deserved. The knowledge would have complicated her narrative, but not changed her trajectory, would have made her uncomfortable, but not altered her fundamental value system, would have perhaps inspired some charitable gesture, a donation to homeless services, a phone call to ensure he had resources, but not actual relationship, not actual commitment, not actual recognition of his worth, independent of his net worth. The truth of that settled over Catherine like weight pressing down from above, compressing her chest and making breath difficult, forcing her to confront exactly who she was and what she had done with a clarity that wouldn't allow evasion or excuse or the comfortable lies that had sustained her through 2 years of remarried prosperity. Thomas saw the understanding arrive in her face, saw her eyes filling with tears she was too proud to release, saw her body sag slightly, as though the full weight of recognition was physical burden her frame couldn't support, and he felt something like sympathy for her, because he understood that she was discovering something terrible about herself in this moment, was learning that she had become the kind of person who abandons others when they lose utility, who measures human value in currency, who treats love as commodity that can be withdrawn when the cost of maintaining it exceeds perceived benefit. That kind of self-knowledge represented its own poverty, its own homelessness, its own kind of cold that couldn't be solved with shelter or clothing, and Thomas found himself pitying her, even as he recognized that she had earned her suffering through her choices, had constructed the cage she now found herself trapped inside, had become precisely the kind of person she had once looked down on from her penthouse windows without understanding that cruelty and callousness weren't distributed by income bracket, that the capacity to harm others existed in luxury apartments just as surely as on street corners. Catherine stood paralyzed on the sidewalk while Thomas walked away, his figure diminishing with each step, until the darkness between streetlights consumed him completely, leaving her alone with the full weight of recognition that couldn't be displaced or denied or softened by any of the justifications she had relied upon to sleep peacefully in her remarried bed. Her current husband waited at home in their penthouse, unaware that his wife had just been mugged and rescued, unaware that her rescuer had been the homeless ex-husband she rarely mentioned, unaware that the foundation of their marriage was being examined and found structurally unsound because it rested on the same principles that had allowed her to abandon Thomas when he stopped being wealthy, suggesting that her current commitment possessed the same conditional nature, the same vulnerability to circumstance, the same terrible willingness to discard human beings when they ceased providing sufficient utility. She imagined telling him what had happened tonight and couldn't construct any version of the story that didn't reveal something shameful about her character, something that would make him question whether the woman he married was capable of loyalty or whether she merely performed loyalty when circumstances made it cost-free and convenient. The walk home took her through streets that seemed different now, transformed by Thomas's presence even in his absence, every homeless person she passed becoming suddenly visible in ways they had never been before, no longer just background elements of urban landscape, but actual humans, with histories and trajectories and circumstances she couldn't know, but could now imagine with uncomfortable vividness. She had always understood intellectually that homeless people had been something else before becoming homeless, had possessed jobs and relationships and identities beyond their current circumstances. But this understanding had remained abstract, theoretical, safely distant from her actual experience, and therefore requiring nothing from her beyond occasional charitable donation that allowed her to feel generous while maintaining comfortable distance from actual engagement with poverty's reality. Now she saw them differently because she had seen Thomas, had witnessed what 2 years of homelessness had done to his body and his clothing and his face, had observed the careful way he moved as though always calculating energy expenditure against available resources, and she couldn't unknow what she now knew, that each person sleeping in doorways or asking for change had been reduced from complexity to category, from full human to social problem, from individual deserving dignity to statistic to be managed or ignored. Her apartment building's doorman greeted her with the professional courtesy that money purchases, holding the door and asking if she needed anything, never mentioning her disheveled appearance or the slight tremor still visible in her hands, maintaining the fiction that people like her don't experience the kind of chaos that had just visited her on that dark street. She rode the elevator to the penthouse in silence, watching the numbers climb, while her mind remained stuck on Thomas's face, on the blood at the corner of his mouth, on his eyes that had looked at her without accusation but also without affection, without any residue of the connection they had once shared, as though she had become stranger to him, as though the divorce had accomplished what she had presumably wanted: complete separation, total severance of all bonds, relationship reduced to legal status of former spouses, who meant nothing to each other beyond shared history that no longer carried weight or obligation. She had wanted that severance when she left him, had desired freedom from his failure and his poverty and his inability to maintain the lifestyle she considered minimum acceptable standard, but confronting it now from the opposite direction, seeing that she meant nothing to him anymore, that he could walk away from her as easily as she had walked away from him, felt devastating in ways she couldn't fully process. Her current husband, Robert, was awake when she entered the penthouse, working in his home office on business matters that stretched across time zones and required his attention even at this late hour, and he barely looked up when she appeared in the doorway, so absorbed in his screens and his spreadsheets and his calculations of profit margins and market positions. She studied him with new eyes, wondering if their marriage represented love, or merely mutual arrangement of convenience, partnership based on compatible lifestyles rather than genuine intimacy between separate persons who had chosen each other for reasons beyond economic utility. Robert was wealthy, significantly wealthier than Thomas had been even at his peak, and Catherine had married him knowing this, had selected him partly for his ability to maintain her in the manner she preferred, though she had told herself and others that she loved him, that they had connection beyond their shared social class and spending habits. Now she questioned that narrative, because if she could abandon one husband when he lost his money, what prevented her from abandoning another if circumstances changed? And more importantly, what prevented him from abandoning her if she ever failed to provide whatever utility he derived from their marriage? She didn't tell Robert about the mugging or the rescue or the recognition, couldn't find words to explain what had happened without revealing too much about herself, about the foundation upon which their marriage rested, about the uncomfortable truth that she had demonstrated through her treatment of Thomas, that her commitment extended only as far as prosperity did, that her love possessed clear boundaries defined by lifestyle expectations and financial security. Instead, she pleaded headache and went to bed alone, lying in darkness while her mind replayed the encounter over and over, examining it from different angles and finding no perspective that allowed her to escape judgment, no interpretation that transformed her actions into anything other than abandonment of another human being in desperate circumstances because his desperation had become inconvenient to her own comfort. Sleep refused to arrive, driven away by thoughts that circled like vultures over carrion, picking apart the narrative she had constructed about her divorce being justified and reasonable and necessary, revealing the bones underneath, that she had valued money more than the man, had loved luxury more than loyalty, had chosen ease over ethics when those values came into conflict. Morning found her exhausted and hollow, moving through the routines of her privileged life with new consciousness of how much of what she considered normal represented outrageous fortune to most of humanity, how her breakfast cost more than many people earned in a day, how her clothing represented more resources than entire families lived on for months, how every element of her existence testified to inequality so extreme it would have seemed obscene to her if she had allowed herself to see it clearly rather than accepting it as natural order of things. She attended her scheduled lunch with friends who occupied her same social stratum, wealthy women who discussed charity work and vacation plans and the difficulty of finding good help, their conversation floating on surface of actual reality without ever penetrating to depths where uncomfortable truths lived. Catherine listened to herself participating in this conversation, heard her own voice making the expected responses, and felt like she was watching stranger perform, like the woman speaking bore no relationship to the woman who had stood on that street corner confronting the human cost of her values, the actual consequence of measuring worth in wealth and treating people as disposable when their economic utility expired. Days passed, and then weeks while Catherine tried to resume normal life, tried to pretend the encounter with Thomas hadn't fundamentally altered her understanding of herself and her choices, and the person she had become in pursuit of comfort and security. But the pretense grew harder to maintain as she found herself thinking about him constantly, wondering where he slept and whether he had enough to eat and whether he was safe in circumstances that she now understood included dangers she had never had to consider, never had to calculate as part of daily existence. She began noticing things she had previously overlooked. The homeless man who sat outside her favorite boutique, the woman pushing a shopping cart filled with belongings through the financial district, the teenager sleeping on subway grates to absorb warmth rising from underground tunnels. And each sighting triggered memories of Thomas's face, his thin frame, his careful movements that suggested injury or exhaustion or both. She found herself researching homeless services in Manhattan, discovering that shelters operated at capacity most nights, that waiting lists stretched for months for supportive housing, that the infrastructure designed to catch falling humans was vastly inadequate to the number actually falling, leaving thousands to manage survival through improvisation and luck, and the mercy of strangers who mostly preferred to look away rather than acknowledge the suffering occurring just outside their peripheral vision. The research led her deeper into territory she had never explored, into statistics about life expectancy for homeless populations, and rates of violence they experienced, and health conditions that went untreated because emergency rooms could only provide crisis care, not ongoing management of chronic diseases that poverty both caused and exacerbated. She learned that being homeless in New York meant dying on average 3 decades earlier than housed populations, meant experiencing assault and robbery at rates that would constitute humanitarian crisis if the victims possessed enough social capital to make their suffering visible to people with power to change conditions. She learned that Thomas was living in circumstances that were literally killing him, that every night he spent on the streets represented Russian roulette with slightly better odds, but the same eventual certainty of fatal outcome if played long enough, and this knowledge sat in her chest like stone, heavy and cold and impossible to dislodge through any of the comfortable rationalizations she had previously relied upon to maintain emotional distance from other people's suffering. She began volunteering at a homeless shelter in Brooklyn, telling Robert and her friends that she wanted to give back, that she felt called to service, constructing a narrative that made her actions seem virtuous rather than desperate, that disguised her actual motivation, which was simply to understand the world Thomas now inhabited, to see the infrastructure that was supposed to help people in his situation, and to witness firsthand how inadequate that infrastructure was to the scale of need it attempted to address. The shelter served dinner 6 nights a week to anyone who arrived. No questions asked, no requirements beyond basic behavioral rules about no violence and no substance use on premises. And Catherine worked in the serving line, ladling soup and distributing bread, while hundreds of people filed past, each carrying stories she would never know, histories that had led them from wherever they had started to this cafeteria, with its fluorescent lighting and its institutional furniture and its atmosphere of dignified desperation. She scanned every face, hoping and dreading that she might see Thomas, that he might walk through those doors and recognize her serving food behind the counter, that they might have to acknowledge each other again in this different context where her wealth meant nothing, and his poverty was simply one version of the poverty surrounding them on all sides. He never appeared at the shelter during her shifts, and she didn't know whether to feel relieved or disappointed. Didn't know what she would say to him if they met again, what conversation could possibly occur between them that wouldn't simply rehearse the same recognitions that had already transpired on that street corner weeks ago. But the work itself changed something in her. exposed her to realities that her previous life had been carefully constructed to avoid, forced her to witness dignity persisting in circumstances designed to destroy it, forced her to see that the people she served possessed the same complexity and humanity she claimed for herself, that poverty hadn't stripped them of personhood, even though it had stripped them of almost everything else. She met veterans who had served their country and then been abandoned by it, met families who had been evicted after medical emergencies consumed their savings, met people with mental illness who had been released from institutions without adequate community support, met workers whose jobs had been eliminated or outsourced or automated away, leaving them with obsolete skills in economies that had moved on without them. Each story revealed the lie she had told herself about Thomas and about poverty in general, that it represented personal failure, individual inability to compete successfully in marketplace that rewarded merit and punished incompetence. Instead, she saw that poverty resulted from structural conditions largely beyond individual control, from decisions made by people with power about how to allocate resources and who deserved support and what responsibilities society bore toward its most vulnerable members. Thomas hadn't become homeless because he was lazy or stupid or morally deficient. He had become homeless because he had lost his fortune in economic collapse, had then lost his marriage when his wife decided poverty made him unworthy of her continued presence, had then been unable to find employment that paid enough to afford housing in a city where rents had increased far beyond wage growth for decades, had then fallen into homelessness that became its own barrier to employment, because employers discriminated against candidates without addresses, without clean clothes, without the presentation of stability that housed people took for granted. Catherine started giving money to homeless people she encountered on the street, large amounts by their standards, though barely noticeable in her budget. 20s and 50s, and sometimes hundreds, handed over in brief transactions that probably made little long-term difference, but that she hoped might ease immediate suffering, might purchase a night in a cheap hotel or a decent meal or winter coat from second-hand store. She knew this charity was inadequate, knew it addressed symptoms without touching causes, knew it might even be counterproductive if it made her feel like she had done something sufficient when the real requirement was systemic change in how society allocated resources and dignity. But she couldn't do nothing, couldn't simply return to her previous existence, pretending she hadn't seen what she had seen, hadn't learned what she now knew about the relationship between poverty and suffering, between wealth and willful blindness, between her comfortable life and the desperate circumstances of people whose labor and whose exclusion actually enabled that comfort in ways she was only beginning to understand. Her marriage to Robert began to show strain under the weight of her transformation, her growing awareness of inequality creating friction, with his comfortable certainty that wealth represented earned reward for superior effort, that poverty indicated personal failure rather than structural injustice. They argued about taxation and social programs and the moral obligations of the fortunate toward the unfortunate, arguments that revealed how fundamentally different their values were, how much of their apparent compatibility had been based on shared lifestyle rather than shared principles, how little they actually agreed about once conversation moved beyond which restaurant to visit or which charity gala to attend. Robert found her new preoccupation with homelessness tedious and incomprehensible, saw her volunteer work as phase she would outgrow rather than genuine transformation of consciousness, suggested that she was suffering some kind of breakdown or crisis that therapy might address. He couldn't understand why she would choose to spend time in shelters when she could be enjoying the privileges their wealth afforded, why she would give away money to people who would probably waste it on substances rather than using it productively, why she seemed determined to make herself miserable by dwelling on problems that had existed long before she noticed them and would continue existing long after she lost interest. 3 months after the encounter, Catherine finally admitted to herself that her marriage to Robert was as hollow as her marriage to Thomas had been, that she had simply repeated the same pattern with different man in different penthouse, with different specific details but identical fundamental emptiness at the core. Relationship built on convenience and compatibility of circumstances, rather than genuine intimacy between persons who had chosen each other for reasons beyond economic utility. She had loved neither of them the way love was supposed to work, according to the vows she had spoken twice, had loved instead what they provided, what they enabled, what they protected her from having to experience or consider or acknowledge. The realization arrived not as sudden revelation, but as gradual accumulation of small recognitions building toward unavoidable conclusion, like water collecting behind dam, until pressure exceeds structural capacity, and the barrier fails completely, releasing everything it had contained. She understood now that she had married wealth twice and never married an actual human being, had treated both husbands as instruments of lifestyle maintenance rather than as separate persons deserving recognition independent of their utility to her comfort. But understanding didn't translate easily into action, because leaving Robert would mean abandoning the security she had sacrificed Thomas to regain, would mean demonstrating that she had learned nothing from her first divorce except that she would rather be alone than continue participating in relationship based on foundations she now recognized as corrupt. She tried to imagine herself divorced again, living on whatever settlement she could negotiate, no longer occupying the social position that marriage to billionaire afforded, no longer able to move through spaces reserved for the wealthy, no longer protected by the insulation that money provides against the world's sharp edges and uncomfortable truths. The prospect terrified her not because she feared poverty. She wouldn't be poor, even a modest settlement would leave her wealthier than most Americans, but because she feared the judgment that would follow her second divorce from wealthy man, the speculation about what was wrong with her that she couldn't maintain marriages to billionaires, the whispered suggestions that perhaps she was the problem rather than her husband's. She spent hours walking through Manhattan in neighborhoods she had previously avoided, streets where Thomas might be sleeping or eating or simply existing in the slow, grinding way that homelessness requires. Every hour consumed by the logistics of survival rather than pursuit of comfort or accomplishment or any of the projects that give shape to housed lives. She never saw him, though she looked for him compulsively, scanning faces and gaits and postures for anything familiar, anything that might be the man she had known wearing the poverty she had condemned him to by withdrawing her support at the moment he needed it most. The not seeing became its own torment because it left her imagination free to construct scenarios of what might be happening to him, where he was sleeping and whether he was safe and whether he was sick or injured or simply slowly dying from exposure and malnutrition and the 1,000 other ways that poverty kills people while society looks away and calls it natural selection, calls it personal responsibility, calls it anything except what it actually is, collective decision to allow some humans to suffer and die because helping them would require the comfortable to accept slightly less comfort. Winter arrived early and brutal, temperatures dropping below freezing and staying there for days at a time, the kind of cold that kills homeless people with reliable efficiency, that turns sleeping outdoors from discomfort into literal death sentence for anyone who doesn't find shelter before dark. Catherine read the news reports of bodies found in doorways and under bridges and felt each death like personal accusation, like the universe asking her whether Thomas might be next, whether the man who had saved her life might lose his own, because she had decided years ago that his poverty made him unworthy of her continued concern. She increased her donations to homeless services, wrote checks with zeros that made the recipients blink and ask if she was certain, funded emergency shelter expansions and cold weather outreach programs, and medical services specifically designed for homeless populations, throwing money at the problem with the desperate hope that enough money might somehow reach Thomas even if she couldn't find him directly, might somehow keep him alive through this winter that threatened to kill him, along with dozens or hundreds of others whose deaths would be noted briefly in local news and then forgotten by everyone except the few people who had known them as individuals rather than statistics. She hired a private investigator to locate Thomas, providing his name and description and last known information, authorizing whatever expense proved necessary to find one homeless man among the thousands who lived on New York streets and in its shelters and its hidden spaces that existed in the gaps between official city and actual city. The investigator returned after 2 weeks with sighting reports from 3 different shelters and one outreach worker who remembered Thomas but hadn't seen him in weeks, who worried that he might be avoiding shelters for reasons the outreach worker couldn't determine. Maybe bad experience with another resident. Maybe mental health deterioration that made him distrust indoor spaces. Maybe simple exhaustion with the rules and requirements and lines and waiting that characterized institutional assistance, driving some people to choose streets over shelters even when streets meant freezing. The investigator continued searching, checking hospitals and jails and morgues with the grim thoroughness of someone who understood that homeless people disappeared into systems that didn't always track them carefully, that sometimes died without anyone noting their passing, except as paperwork requiring processing. Finally, on a night when snow was falling thick and heavy, and the city was warning people to stay indoors, because exposure could kill within hours, Catherine's phone rang with the investigator's number, and her heart stopped briefly before restarting at double speed. Her mind racing through possibilities, found him alive, found him injured, found him dead, each outcome existing simultaneously until the investigator spoke and collapsed probability into single reality. Thomas had been located at a winter emergency shelter in the Bronx, one of the facilities Catherine's donations had funded to expand, and he was alive but sick, running fever and coughing badly enough that shelter staff were considering sending him to emergency room if his condition didn't improve. Catherine was in her car before the call ended, driving through snow-empty streets toward the Bronx, while Robert slept unaware in their penthouse, racing toward reunion she had no script for, no plan beyond the overwhelming need to see Thomas, to confirm he was alive, to somehow communicate everything she had learned and understood and regretted since that night when he had saved her life and she had confronted what her choices had cost them both. The shelter occupied a former warehouse, its vast space divided into sections by temporary walls and curtains, hundreds of cots arranged in rows, while overhead lights buzzed with the particular frequency that institutional spaces seemed to emit, sound that suggested surveillance and management rather than comfort or care. Catherine identified herself to staff as donor visiting to see conditions firsthand, which was technically true, even if her actual motivation was entirely personal. And they allowed her into the sleeping area, where men occupied cots in various states of rest or wakefulness, some sleeping deeply, while others lay staring at ceiling or talking quietly to neighbors or simply existing in the liminal space of shelter. Neither street nor home, but temporary reprieve from exposure that could be revoked at morning when everyone had to leave, regardless of weather or health or any other consideration, besides the shelter's operational hours. She walked between rows, scanning faces until she found him in far corner, his body curled beneath thin blanket, his face flushed with fever and slick with sweat. His breathing rough and labored in a way that suggested pneumonia or worse, suggested illness that required medical intervention beyond what shelter could provide. Catherine knelt beside Thomas's cot with her expensive coat brushing against concrete floor that thousands of feet had worn smooth. her presence drawing curious glances from nearby residents who recognized that she didn't belong here, that her clothing and her bearing and her evident discomfort all marked her as intruder from different world, tourist visiting poverty without actually experiencing it. Thomas's eyes were closed, but his breathing suggested he wasn't truly sleeping, wasn't finding rest, but rather enduring consciousness, without energy to maintain full wakefulness. His body fighting infection with resources, depleted by months of inadequate nutrition and exposure, and the general wearing down that homelessness accomplishes through its relentless grinding away of health and strength and resilience. She said his name quietly, not wanting to startle him, not wanting their reunion to begin with shock or fear, or any more disorientation than his fever was already causing. His eyes opened slowly, struggling to focus, and she watched recognition arrive gradually, saw him processing her presence with visible confusion, trying to reconcile the Catherine he knew, the wealthy ex-wife who had abandoned him, with the Catherine kneeling beside his shelter cot at 2 a.m. during snowstorm. "You shouldn't be here," he said finally, his voice rough as gravel, each word clearly costing him effort he could barely afford, given his weakened state. "This isn't safe for someone like you. These aren't your people." The words carried no hostility, just factual assessment of the distance between her world and his, acknowledgement that she had crossed boundary that normally remained firmly in place, keeping the wealthy separate from the poor, except in carefully managed contexts where the poor served the wealthy or the wealthy performed charity for the poor, relationships structured by roles that prevented actual recognition of shared humanity. Catherine felt the truth of his observation like blow to chest, felt the way her presence here was inherently temporary and therefore fundamentally different from his, felt how she could leave whenever she wanted while he had to stay because he had nowhere else to go, how her visit to poverty represented choice, while his existence in poverty represented circumstance beyond his control. "I've been looking for you," she said, her voice breaking slightly on the words, emotion she had been containing for months, suddenly pressing against inadequate barriers she had constructed to hold it back. "Since that night when you saved me, I've been trying to find you, trying to understand what happened to you, trying to—" She stopped because she didn't know how to finish that sentence, didn't know what she had been trying to do except somehow undo what couldn't be undone, somehow communicate regret that was both sincere and utterly insufficient to the harm she had caused, somehow transform understanding into action that might make difference, even though the essential damage was historical, locked into past beyond reach of current intention. Thomas watched her struggle with something like patience, waited for her to find words that might bridge gap between them, but they both knew that no words could actually accomplish that impossible task, that the divorce and the years that followed had created distance that couldn't be crossed by language alone. "I was wrong," Catherine said finally, abandoning attempt at complex explanation and simply stating the central truth that had been growing in her consciousness since their encounter. "I was wrong about what mattered, wrong about what made you valuable, wrong about what I should have been protecting and preserving and honoring. I treated you like you were only worth something because of your money, and when you lost the money, I acted like you had lost everything that made you deserve my loyalty. But you never stopped being the person you were. You never stopped being kind or brave or decent. You just stopped being wealthy. And I decided that was the same as stopping being worthy, and I was wrong about that in ways I'm still discovering." The words tumbled out, rushed and inadequate, failing to capture the full scope of her recognition, the full depth of her regret, the full weight of responsibility she now accepted for choosing comfort over commitment, for abandoning another human when he needed her most, for demonstrating through her actions that her love had always been conditional on circumstances remaining favorable. Thomas closed his eyes briefly, processing her confession with visible exhaustion, and when he opened them again, they held sadness rather than anger, grief rather than rage, acknowledgement that they had both lost something valuable through her choice to prioritize wealth over relationship. "Catherine," he said gently, his fever-roughened voice somehow making the gentleness more devastating. "You weren't wrong about what you valued. You were honest about it. Most people lie to themselves about why they love who they love, about what would make them stop loving. You at least had the clarity to recognize that you valued the lifestyle more than you valued me, and you had the courage to act on that recognition rather than staying and resenting me for failing to provide what you wanted. That honesty was painful, but it wasn't wrong." His words rejected her self-accusation while somehow making it worse, reframing her abandonment as coherent choice based on authentic values, rather than momentary failure or misunderstanding that could be corrected, forcing her to confront that she had been exactly who she appeared to be, that the problem wasn't confusion about her values, but the values themselves. She wanted to protest that she had changed, that she no longer measured worth in wealth, that the months since their reunion had transformed her understanding of what mattered, but the protest died unspoken because what did change matter now? What difference did her transformation make to Thomas, who had spent 2 years homeless because she had withdrawn her support when he needed it most, who was currently sick with infection that might kill him because he had no permanent housing, no consistent health care, no buffer against the countless dangers that poverty exposed him to constantly? Her change of heart couldn't undo the past, couldn't restore the years he had lost, couldn't compensate for the suffering he had endured while she rebuilt her comfortable life on foundation of new billionaire husband. The futility of her regret felt crushing, felt like punishment perfectly calibrated to the crime, forcing her to understand what she had done without granting her any power to undo it, leaving her wealthy and comfortable and miserable while Thomas remained poor and sick and somehow still more decent than she had ever managed to be. "Let me help you," she said finally, abandoning any attempt to address their history and focusing instead on immediate present, on his fever and his cough and his presence in emergency shelter during winter that could kill him if he remained exposed. "Let me get you medical care. Let me find you housing. Let me use my resources to make your life safer, more comfortable, more survivable. I know it doesn't fix what I did. I know it doesn't change the past. But please, let me at least try to make the present less terrible." She heard the desperation in her own voice, heard herself pleading in ways she had never pleaded before, offering help that she knew was simultaneously necessary and insufficient, simultaneously genuine and self-serving, because helping him now would allow her to feel slightly less terrible about abandoning him before, would give her some action to point to when her conscience demanded accounting for her choices. Thomas studied her face for a long moment, his fever-bright eyes seeming to look deeper than her words, trying to assess whether her offer emerged from genuine concern for his well-being or from need to assuage her own guilt, whether she wanted to help him or help herself feel better about having hurt him. Finally, he spoke with the careful deliberation of someone making decision that would reshape his future in ways he couldn't fully predict. "I'll accept medical care because I think I need it, and I can't access it without help. But I won't accept housing or money or anything that creates ongoing obligation between us. You and I are finished, Catherine. We finished when you divorced me, and nothing that happens now changes that fundamental fact. I appreciate that you regret your choices. I appreciate that you've apparently learned something from our encounter, but I don't want relationship with you in any form. Don't want you trying to salvage your conscience by playing savior to the man you abandoned. Help me get medical care if you want. But after that, we go back to being what we actually are, strangers who used to know each other, whose lives crossed briefly and then diverged permanently. His words landed with finality that made Catherine's chest ache, made her understand that she had been harboring impossible hope that somehow her transformation might allow them to reconnect, might allow her to prove she had changed sufficiently to deserve his forgiveness, or at least his acknowledgement that she was no longer the person who had abandoned him. But Thomas was offering no such possibility, was making clear that her growth meant nothing to him because it couldn't change what she had already done, couldn't restore what she had already destroyed, couldn't transform their relationship from ruins into anything habitable or whole. She had wanted absolution, and he was offering only factual assessment, that they were finished, that her help now couldn't purchase reconciliation, that the distance between them was permanent, regardless of her regret or his survival. The rejection hurt in ways she hadn't anticipated, but that she recognized as just, as earned, as appropriate consequence for demonstrating through her actions that people were disposable when they stopped serving her needs. She called an ambulance despite his protests that emergency room would be expensive and useless, used her insurance information to ensure he would be admitted and treated, stayed with him through the transport and the intake and the initial examination that confirmed pneumonia and dehydration and malnutrition, requiring intervention beyond what shelter or streets could provide. She arranged private room and specialist care and every comfort that money could purchase, while understanding that none of it actually touched him in ways that mattered. That physical healing couldn't address the essential wound she had inflicted by abandoning him when he needed her most. That her resources could ease his immediate suffering, but couldn't restore his trust or his belief that human connection possessed value beyond immediate utility. When hospital staff told her he was settled and stable and that she could leave, she lingered in doorway, watching him sleep, seeing in his sleeping face the man she had married and the man she had divorced and the man who had saved her despite everything she had done to him, seeing all three simultaneously and understanding that she would carry this image for whatever remained of her life, that Thomas, sleeping in hospital bed, would become permanent resident of her consciousness, reminder of what she had been and what she had learned and what she could never undo, no matter how much she changed or grew or came to understand about human worth and the terrible consequences of measuring it in currency. She left the hospital as dawn broke over Manhattan, emerging into cold morning air that felt cleaner than the recycled atmosphere inside, emerging into day that would continue regardless of her recognition or her regret or her desperate wish that she could travel backward through time and choose differently when Thomas needed her to choose him over comfort, him over wealth, him over the lifestyle she had treated as more important than the actual human being who had made that lifestyle possible. She walked for hours through waking city, while her phone buzzed with messages from Robert wondering where she was, walked until exhaustion made her numb, walked until she had worn away enough of her immediate emotion to face the day ahead, and the life she had constructed, and the decisions she now understood she needed to make about whether to continue participating in existence. She recognized as hollow, as built on values she no longer accepted, as requiring her to be person she no longer wanted to be, even though becoming different person would require sacrifices she didn't know if she possessed courage to make.